All right, we're back again for another episode of Spooky Software. So last episode, we were talking a little bit about Webpack and what it does, exactly how it kind of fits into these tools. And I think that, I wanted to expand on that series a little bit more because there's a lot more in the sort of front-end build tool infrastructure out there, and it can be quite overwhelming. So I'm trying to condense it down into maybe a series of episodes where we kind of break these problems down one by one. So last time we talked about the bundler, and if you haven't seen that episode, you should definitely check that out because it's basically prerequisite knowledge for this one. But today we're going to be using Webpack to deal with more kinds of files, right? So in the previous episode, we had basically just JavaScript, right? We had this kind of calculator app. It looks something like this. I have changed it a little bit, and we'll get to that in a moment. But basically it had you could type in some values and it would calculate the things, and all of the code was written with JavaScript, right? And Webpack was capable of reading these JavaScript files and building this dependency graph and sort of bundling it all together into like one file so that our application could run in the browser, right? Well, it turns out that web applications have more than JavaScript, or maybe they don't even have any JavaScript. Maybe they are just HTML, CSS, and whatnot, but we didn't touch on that at all. We didn't touch on things like images. We didn't touch on things like, maybe SVGs, CSS. We certainly didn't touch on any kind of like alternative script files, like for instance, maybe TypeScript or CoffeeScript or, other kinds of executable code that actually can't run in the browser directly, right? So today we're going to be touching on that, at least in terms of CSS and like asset files, things like SVGs, images, maybe fonts, etc. So as it turns out, so as of the recording of this video, which is, in the middle of 2021, Webpack doesn't really understand directly itself anything other than JavaScript, and maybe some JSON too. So if I were to say, oh, I want to make this calculator app look a lot better, right? It's not so good. I want to add some CSS, right? How do I do that? How do I bundle that with my JavaScript? Well, sort of the most natural thing for me to want to do. So this is just a diff. So I've prepared this before the recording, but essentially, so here I've changed some of the HTML and I've added a bunch of classes, and I want those classes to come from a CSS file. We don't have to spend any time looking at this. This is just, all basically some accessibility things. You are making your web apps accessible, right? And of course, classes to make it look nice once we get our CSS working. Let's just glance at the dependencies that I've gotten from NPM to sort of make this work. So I have some post CSS and auto prefixer things. If you don't know what these are, doesn't matter, just ignore them. Most importantly for now, I want you to pay attention to this Tailwind. Okay, so that's where all of these classes are coming from, right? If you haven't used Tailwind, it's a CSS framework, kind of like Bootstrap or something else. It comes with all these classes, these utility classes. So I have used those utility classes in my HTML, and I want to bundle them with the application, right? These loaders like Style Loader, Post CSS Loader, and CSS Loader, we will get to those in a moment. That's actually sort of what enables Webpack to deal with files that are not JavaScript or JSON, right? So I have some configuration for Post CSS. I've changed some HTML, no big deal there. And I've written this .css file, right? This is the actual file that I want, and I've included all the Tailwind stuff that I want. So to be clear, this is going to, inside this CSS file, is going to write a bunch of utility classes that I've been utilizing in my HTML, like for instance, font semi-bold, right? And so my most natural thing that I want to do is I just want to write a line like this, right? So in my sort of entry point src/index.js, I just want to say import.css, right? In the same way that I said import from the math.js file, here I've said index.css. I've included the .css because by default Webpack will look for JavaScript files, but if I specify the file type, it can import more kinds of files. But so that's all I've really changed, right? As I've changed some HTML. Here's some more configuration for Tailwind, not important, and then there's the yarn.lock file. So I've written some HTML and I've used some classes that I want, and I've tried to import the CSS. So let's see what happens when I build this. So if I try to actually build this file, it's going to complain. It says it broke, and it says, well, you know, I read the JavaScript file and I noticed that you imported this .css file, and like it started to parse that file, and it's parsing it because it's looking for other imports. It thinks it's going to be a JavaScript file, but this syntax here is CSS, or post CSS, I suppose, and it doesn't know what this is. It says like, I can't figure this out, and it says, oh, it even gives us a helpful hint. It says you may need an appropriate loader to handle this file type. Let me just make this. Currently, no loaders are configured to process this file, blah, blah, blah. Okay? And it even gives you a link to the documentation if you're interested in this. But essentially, what a loader is, as we will see in the configuration in just a moment, a loader is a way for you to tell Webpack when you encounter a file of a certain variety, and you know, you might specify that file by just like, what is the file extension? You might specify by more complex rules like what directory it's in or whatever. But essentially, when you import a file of a certain, you know, shape, I want you to execute this loader on that first, right? And you can actually specify as many loaders as you need, and they sort of happen in a pipeline. And at the end of the day, sort of the output of that final loader, and we will see this very concretely in a moment, should be something that Webpack can actually understand, and that's basically going to be JavaScript, right? So a loader's job, if you will, is literally to translate something that is not JavaScript into something that is JavaScript and can be bundled in this JavaScript bundle that Webpack natively understands and exports. So let's actually check out another. So if I look at this, what I have done is I've changed the Webpack config file, and I've added this module like section or whatever, and I said rules, and I can specify as many as I need. This is an array, and I said, hey, here's your test Webpack. If the file that you are importing matches this regular expression, the file name. In this case, it is a file that ends in .css, right? We're sort of matching on the file extension. I want you to use these loaders. And this loader, this use is like, I want you to run these loaders on them in order. It turns out that Webpack is right to left. So actually, in a sense, the first loader that is going to be run on that file will be post CSS, then CSS, and then style loader. And then once you've run all these loaders, then I want you to try to do your normal sort of behavior after that, right? So what is this literally doing? Well, the post CSS loader is a loader that runs the post CSS processor on the CSS file. So the output of that is a CSS file that has no post CSS. So just a moment ago, when we were looking at the changes that I had made, like this at Tailwind thing, that's a post CSS thing. It's not CSS. It's a post CSS thing. So the output of that initial loader, that post CSS loader, will be just CSS. And you know, in the case of like these Tailwind directives, I think it just basically copy and pastes, you know, Tailwind utility classes into these places, right? So there's going to be some base classes, some component classes, and some utility classes. They're just going to be copy, almost imported, if you will. Okay. And again, let's take a look at this. And it says, okay, well, once you've used that post CSS loader, once it's finished, I want you to pipeline that into the CSS loader. So this is a very popular loader for CS files in Webpack. It's, you know, called exactly what it is. And this is going to deal with maybe further imports, right? So maybe you use CSS to import fonts, or you use CSS to import other CSS files or whatever. So again, you know, Webpack by default does not understand the CSS syntax. It doesn't know how to parse CSS to find these imports and to add to this dependency graph. So this CSS loader is going to do that for us. And then finally, we load the style loader, right? And so what this does is it translates CSS. It should be basically a CSS string. And it's going to translate it into JavaScript and write some like sort of a wrapper code around that JavaScript to make it actually load in the browser, like maybe add a style tag to the head or whatever, and actually make this thing executable at runtime. So now that I have this, if I run this again, this is going to take a second because there's a lot of CSS in Tailwind, maybe a couple megabytes. Let's see what happens here. Okay, so it finished and it didn't complain this time. And I'm actually going to look at the output file. And it's going to take a minute to load because there's 8 megabytes of JavaScript it's going to have to parse or whatever. But and we will see that that CSS has actually been translated into JavaScript. So it ran through these pipelines one by one, and it ended up with something that was usable by Webpack. So you can see here, and I don't want to like parse this too much because again, this is like 8 megabytes or whatever. This like .push and then a JavaScript string is the output of that style loader, the last one in order. And you know, it probably, this string right here, you can see this is like sort of output of that CSS and post CSS loader where it, you know, that @tailwind directive, it is now sort of copy pasted in some Tailwind utilities from my npm package. So hopefully this all kind of makes sense where we gave, through this module rules and loaders, we gave Webpack the ability to sort of pre-process, if you will, files it doesn't understand natively. And it doesn't understand anything natively other than basically JavaScript and JSON. And so actually, so now that we've kind of examined this, I don't want to look at it. It's kind of crazy, right? Now that we've examined this, let's just refresh our app. And okay, so now we've got some nice CSS, right? And if I take a look at this page, I should find somewhere in here, okay, look, here's a style tag, and you know, it's got a bunch of CSS in it as a string. This is that process string that came out of those loaders, and the style loader at runtime, you know, added this style tag to the page and made it all like look nice, right? Gave us what we needed. And of course, you know, this all still works and looks beautiful and does its thing. Okay, great. Our calculator is good, and it now has some styles, and we know how to import CSS. Well, it turns out that there's other kinds of files that you may want in a web application, like fonts, SVGs, etc. We talked about those a little bit. So I'm just going to again, pull up another prepared branch that I have. So I'll just go to add image here. And let's take a look at this diff. So I have this calculator.svg I downloaded from some common Creative Commons website or something. And so I want to add a nice picture of a calculator to my thing. And this is an SVG. And so somebody created this with Inkscape, I'm noticing now. Okay, it's got a lot of stuff. And we'll just ignore that for now. But again, the change to my actual application is basically the same thing, right? I just want to like import a .svg file. Now, SVG files, rather than a side effect, so notice the way that I've imported this, I didn't import anything from it. I've just said include it, if you will. The side effect of that include for the CSS is to, you know, add that style tag to the head of the page and, you know, actually add the CSS and make things appear the way they're supposed to. But an SVG, there's no real side effect. It's kind of like importing, you know, maybe a math module where, you know, I might want to grab an add function from a math module. Well, I might want to grab the SVG data. So like maybe this is you know, the string that is the XML of that SVG document. Or maybe if this is an image, a PNG, maybe I want to grab the base64 encoded data. Or maybe if it's a really large thing, I actually want to import like the URL that this image will be located at at runtime. So I can use it as like, you know, the src attribute of an image tag, right? So I actually do have something. It's not a side effect. I'm getting some data from that calculator. And, you know, I'm creating an image tag in JavaScript, and I'm setting the src to that data. You can see that there. And, you know, I'm adding some classes for some stylistic things. And that's it. I want this to work, right? So let's see what happens again. I'll just run Webpack again. And we expect actually an error, right? Because again, Webpack doesn't know how to deal with anything that's not JavaScript, and now it knows how to deal with CSS, but it doesn't know how to deal with SVGs. And you can see kind of a similar error from before. It says, hey, I tried to import this calculator.svg module. I don't understand that. It's like trying to read this code and it can't parse it because it's, again, not JavaScript. So what I'll do is I'll check out yet another prepared branch. And again, I've added another rule to Webpack that says, hey, when you encounter a file that ends in .svg, I want you to treat the type of that module as an asset, right? So I haven't used loaders here. And this is a little bit new, like as of like maybe 2020 or 2021. So Webpack actually does now, as of Webpack, like I think version 5 or whatever, does actually have some support for non-JavaScript and JSON files. It actually has support for what they call asset modules. And so essentially by default, the type of all assets that you import is something like JavaScript or JavaScript/JSON. It'll just automatically assume that the file that you're importing is JavaScript or JSON, and it expects the output of any module, any loader, to be a JavaScript module, unless you tell it otherwise, right? And so in this case, we are saying, hey, wait a minute. Actually, the output of this is not going to be JavaScript. It's going to be an asset. And essentially, assets are actually very simple because we basically just want the binary. We don't want any processing on them. We basically want either, the data encoded as, base64, or we just want the URL that we can use to set the SRC of an image tag, for instance, or whatever the case may be. And so now we've said, hey, if you encounter an SVG, don't run your JavaScript parser. It's not JavaScript. I just want you to assume it's just some binary, essentially. Okay, so let's see what happens again when we run this thing. And I expect this to work. Okay, it says it's compiled successfully, and I think if I go ahead and refresh this, we will see a nice, beautiful calculator SVG image. Wonderful. And if I take a look at this, if I examine that, remember I set the SRC attribute of this image tag. You notice that it's like it's a URL, it's a string. And so this is where Webpack decided to take this SVG and sort of output it at runtime. And again, if I ls what's in the distribution, you can see that, hey, it actually took that asset and it put it in the distribution. So when I upload this, if I want to run this as a real application on the web, I would upload all these files, including this JSON, this bundled JavaScript file, as well as, the index.html. Now I also have this SVG, and I know that inside this bundle.js, it has included the correct file name and the correct URL, relative URL to this SVG file. Also, you notice that this file name is a little weird. I just want to touch on this for a moment. So this is actually, by default, I think it uses the hash of the SVG file, so the binary. So if this file ever changes in source, when you run Webpack again, this hash will change, and this is really useful for if you want to, use caching or whatever for these static assets. You know that this SVG file hasn't changed because the file name is the same, and you'll get a new file name, a brand new one later, if this SVG ever changes. Maybe I change the color of those buttons on the calculator or whatever. So this is pretty much all I wanted to cover in this video. Just a little bit of understanding of how we get Webpack to understand other kinds of files besides JavaScript, right? I did mention this at the beginning of the video. There are, of course, other kinds of script files that we didn't touch on. So you can use this exact pattern for all kinds of asset files like, fonts, PNGs. You can even import things like .mp3s, maybe if you want to put some audio on the page or a video on the page in MP4, whatever the case may be. You can also have loaders run on things so for instance, I did not do this in this. Even though I have taught Webpack, hey, this is an asset file and just kind of treat it as binary, just give me a URL that I'll use directly. I could actually use some loaders on here, and why I might want to do that, for instance, I think there's one called SVGO Loader, right? This is maybe for minification. So SVGs tend to have a lot of white space or maybe superfluous metadata in them. And at runtime, you know, I want these files to be as small as possible so they load in the browser as quickly as possible. So maybe I want to use a loader to pre-process that binary to make it smaller. And, you know, this loader does know how to read SVGs, right? You could do something like this. And coming back to this idea of other kinds of other kinds of modules, like maybe you have other kinds of script, right? So an example would be TypeScript or CoffeeScript or even something like JSX, right? JSX and all these other things are not natively parsable in JavaScript, and therefore Webpack doesn't understand how to read them. So we'll cover that in a different video because I think that'll kind of lead into another tool called Babel, which is related but not the same thing as Webpack. And so essentially we could use loaders like Babel to pre-process JavaScript from one kind of JavaScript into something that Webpack can understand. And again, I don't want to delve too much into it in this video because I want to keep this sort of short and tight for just things like CSS and sort of asset files. Yeah, so that's all I really wanted to cover. I hope this is helpful. I'll probably continue this web series because it seems like people are interested in this. And the idea of this web series, again, keep in your mind, is that there's a lot of stuff inside of a typical web application repo, a lot of different tools, and they're all kind of doing their different jobs. Like, you know, CSS loaders, style loaders, post CSS, they're all doing their own little part, and they're kind of all like tied together inside of a bundler like Webpack. And so I just want to sort of parse these out, pull these apart so you can sort of understand each part in isolation, and then the larger picture hopefully is more clear where the lines are drawn and why they're drawn this way. All right, I hope you enjoyed. Thanks for watching.